Burns makes the case that there's a difference between a deterministic theory, the kind of theory you would have in physics, where you hit a ball and it'll roll a certain distance given friction or momentum. It's very deterministic. You know exactly what's going to happen. And non-deterministic theories, which is sort of, this is likely to happen given this general set of circumstances, but not guaranteed. It's just the most likely outcome. And he wonders if a historian, a good historian, really needs those kind of non-deterministic theories when he's doing his historical explanation. And I kind of want to know your thoughts about this. Do you feel that historical explanation can inform theory? Do you think that theory informs historical explanation? You talk about how it's a toolkit, but I think in a much more narrow sense I'm asking here, does it help you fill in gaps, or are you trying to fix problems in the theory? Look for exceptions, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I definitely feel, like that those non-probabilistic theories. I think that's a much more plausible way to work. I think Burns talks. I think one of the phrases he uses is the irreducible uncertainty of human behavior, and I think I absolutely buy into that. I think I'm deeply skeptical of anything that says put enough data into this and we can absolutely predict exactly what will happen. I don't even, in the age of sort of big data now, where Google and various people have collected every bit of data point about us to figure out what we want to buy on Amazon or something. I think at the best they can just predict, right? And sometimes they get scarily close, but it's never going to be that absolute certainty. So I'm skeptical of such simple theories. So I think, and the question then is, can we use those sort of slightly looser things of what might happen? And I think we can. And you're right. I think the phrase you used that I really liked was, it's filling gaps. Things that we actually can't derive from a straightforward analysis of evidence. And so I'll give you an example of this. So at the moment, I've been working on a lot on the history of comedy and laughter in the 19th century. And this is the thing, joking and laughter is a thing that leaves really scattered traces, and only part of the act. So what I found millions of, are printed jokes in 19th century newspapers. So I can say with reasonable confidence, these are the kind of jokes people were telling in print, at least. Maybe not what they were telling in private, but in print. What I have absolutely no idea about is why or how people responded or what kind of work they performed, because nobody says, haha, that was a great laugh. I must now go to my diary and record in meticulous detail why I found this funny and the kind of underlying social and political work it was performing. That just doesn't, occasionally you will get somebody write, like a Victorian writing like a 50-page essay on the nature of humour where they think about this stuff, but generally speaking, people don't. So that's where potentially theory can come in, right? So we might take someone like, I don't know, Freud, or somebody who's talking about jokes as an expression of the unconscious, or saying things that we wouldn't say in polite society. That suddenly becomes a really powerful sort of connecting force where I can say, okay, if this theory holds true, and this is debatable, right, whether jokes are expressions of the unconscious, we could sort of think about that. But if it's true, then potentially jokes are telling us things that we might not find in more serious texts, that they're revealing something about, something within Victorians, something that they don't necessarily express publicly or in, normal newspaper articles. That suddenly makes those texts really powerful. That I now have millions of these things that are potentially expressing thoughts that I wouldn't find elsewhere, or at least that they're reinforcing my belief that maybe the Victorians held these beliefs about race, about gender, about class, about certain professions. So in that case, theory potentially is a way to take what might seem like a really inconsequential text, a joke, something as throwaway as a one-liner or a pun, and by sort of passing it through, Freud, but many, there are loads of other ways to interpret jokes. That suddenly actually, it doesn't just sort of fill a gap, but it really amplifies the source and it reveals its significance. So whether the theory holds true, I think, is up for debate, but its usefulness is kind of there. And you're right, it's filling that gap. It's getting into the mind of the Victorian who never said, this is why I found this funny.
So there's two things there I want to touch on. The first one is you point to Freud, who is obviously writing at sort of the end of the Victorian or the early Edwardian period, or I don't know if it's right to talk about Freud in Edwardian terms, but it's not that far from the period you're discussing. But I think what you're implying with what you're saying there is that there are some theories that may be universally applicable to human beings, and I think that gives an idea that if I were looking at jokes from the 18th century, someone very, very far removed from Freud, or from, ancient Greece, someone thousands of years removed from Freud, I would still probably expect the theory to be equally applicable. So if it's true in one situation, and that's, like you said, debatable, but if it is true, then it would be true in lots of different places. And that's sort of an implicit belief that human beings, even if we have different cultures, even if we have different environments, there's something universal about us that we can use over and over again. Do you kind of feel like that's true? Do you utilize that idea when you look at your historical sources and your historical figures?
I think I have a healthy skepticism about it, in the sense that laughter is an interesting thing, because in some respects it sort of is treated as a sort of an involuntary sort of biological thing, something that we can't control. I have a feeling that that's not true. I'm pretty sure that it is culturally specific. I think probably it does change, that laughter means different things at different times, and therefore we probably should be quite cautious about how far we can apply that theory to different cultures, to different time periods. I think, again, I would be looking for the kind of contextual evidence that helps to sort of ground that theory in real circumstances. So I'm skeptical of the universal approach to things. But again, that's only if I was using it as an absolutely cast iron way of saying this absolutely happened. If it's a useful tool of thinking about it, of saying, okay, this is one way in which we might explain this. Here's a kind of, and it may be convincing, it may be not. It may be partial, it may be not. That's as far as I'd want to go with that. I'm skeptical of theory. Basically, I don't like any theory that claims to prove something. I like it as a theories that suggest things, or that
you've just made every scientist watching this cringe. So
yeah, I know, right? Well, because so in a scientific context, absolutely fine. When there are theories that you can apply universally, that say, yeah, if we do X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C will happen, fine. I just don't think humans are like that. I don't think history is like that. At best, we're going to get this is one possible interpretation, and I would always then want the evidence that helps to corroborate that. I would want something that says, okay, here's my theory. Here's the kind of, even if it's just partial evidence, even if it's just 2 or 3 people saying, okay, yeah, that this is sort of how this is playing out on a grand scale. I would want that. I wouldn't want theory on its own. And I think for me, like in the digital humanities at the moment, there are all these attempts to try and do this, right, using big data to try and draw concrete conclusions about the past that you can plot on a graph. And for me, at the most, they're asking questions, they're raising things, saying, go and look at that more closely. I would never want the theory on its own. I wouldn't want to stake my reputation or my interpretation just on the theory. It's got to have some evidence, right?
Absolutely. And that was sort of the other half of what I was going to ask you, is this idea that if we're not using theories as a cast iron way of definitely filling in the gaps, of replacing lost data somehow, do you think that there is something in most historians, I don't want to say contrarianism, but this idea that if somebody comes in and says a generalization or a blanket statement or a rule for the way that human beings react, that's something that historians want to say, well, actually, and prove all the exceptions to the theory instead. Do you think there's something in the historical profession that likes exceptions to the rule?
Maybe. There's definitely something in me that likes that. I mean, I can only speak for myself on this. I think it's one of the things we're taught, isn't it? And I find myself saying this to my students when they talk about the Victorians thought this or the Victorians did that. And I'm like, well, you're talking about millions of people over many decades from a whole range of races, classes, genders, professions. How can you ever say what the Victorians thought? Because there are always going to be variations within that. And so we teach students, or at least I do, to speak in much more cagey language, like, many, middle-class Victorians middle-class Victorians such as X, Y, and Z tended to argue that, that's as far as I would want to go. Of course, having said that, we have to make some generalizations, because we can't talk about the past as if, if we go from the point of view that every individual thinks differently, that acts in a completely individual way, we can never really say anything beyond that individual. So we have to find those patterns. But again, I would always want them to be framed not as universal truths, but as generally observable patterns. I think, there are things that are happening at a broader scale than the individual. There are shared beliefs, shared practices, and we can chart their history. But yeah, I would always be wary of the exception because I think it's always out there. And yeah, I think it's sort of the job of a historian is to be aware of those nuances.
Right, and nuance is a lovely word. It's one of those things that I think gets not overused. It's probably underused actually. There's not a lot of nuance in the world anymore, but it's one of those things that people don't necessarily understand. Nuance isn't just being cagey. I think it's about understanding the extent to which general rules apply and the extent to which there are hidden variables or there are interacting variables, things that are difficult to, we could have a theory that's very, very accurate, but then it would only apply to 3 people. And it's making that balance.
Yeah, I agree.
You mentioned individuals there, and I think that falls on quite nicely to what Burns was talking about. I found this really lovely. He talks about 2 different types of historians. And I had come to a similar conclusion a couple of years ago about different types of historians, but I used entirely different examples than he did. So I wonder where you kind of sit on this. He separates historians into individualistic historians, people who want to understand how an individual person thinks, the individual actions, their individual intentions. And if you add them all up together, sort of like the raindrops in a rain cloud, you'll eventually figure out what the grand movement is. And then the other type of and this is what I would sort of say is sort of Thomas Carlyle idea of history, where individuals have their own agency, their own ideas, maybe even a little Hegelian. But then you have what he refers to as the Tolstoyan version of historians, which I thought was lovely. And it's this idea that there is a momentum in history on its own, and it kind of drags us mere mortals along with it. And I think he means this more metaphorically than literally when we write about history. We either talk about individual agency or we talk about wider movements kind of sweeping people up. When you talk about the media, because it's so difficult to get all of those diary entries, do you find yourself talking about the great momentum and waves of thought and history, or do you find yourself trying to recreate the individual intentions and actions of men and women?
I think the ideal is to try and do both, isn't it? I think if you can, because I don't necessarily see them as opposing things, even though they're kind of 2 extremes of ways of writing. I think both are happening simultaneously in reality, right? And that there are broad things, forces, whether they're technological, political, economic, that affect all of what we do. We're recording this in the middle of a pandemic, right? This is not necessarily the work of any individual. I mean, we could trace it back down to 1,000 different individual responses or actions, but nevertheless, there is this broader context that is shaping everything we're doing. But within that, I think individual people have agency. And so, I mean, that's something I've always felt very strongly about. I've never bought into the idea that people are just sheep being kind of herded along by the media. I think I've always felt in terms of newspapers that individual readers all have agency. They all express that, and they all have power. And so talking about them as a single group all thinking the same way, I've never felt comfortable with. Though, of course, in the absence of evidence, sometimes we have to kind of draw some of those generalizations, again, with nuance. So yeah, I think generally speaking, I would always try and get down to that more individualistic view of things, that more getting down to the specifics of something. But having said that, the PhD I did was basically on like transatlantic relations. So it's basically how millions of people in 2 countries interact with one another. So in a sense, I am interested in those broad things. I don't just want to know. I don't tend to do microhistory. I do tend to do kind of broader cultural studies that investigating concepts or phenomenon that thousands or millions of people might be engaging with or having it shape their lives. But I'm still kind of, I would always want that individual evidence if I can get it, right? You always want to try and get down to that. So I would say that, yeah, ideally I try and do both. I'm quite skeptical of histories that attempt to sort of do like the entire history of the world in 400 pages or something like that. I'm just not really that interested in that kind of, that broad sweep stuff. So that's if that's the kind of the Tolstoyan view, then yeah, I'm probably not into that. But at the same time, I think contextualizing the work of individuals in that kind of wider, along those wider forces that are shaping what they're doing, I think that's fine, right? And I think that's inevitable. But I don't think those wider forces are determining precisely what those people will do. It's like creating a window in which they might make choices, is
Right.
how I think about it. They can't resist those underlying forces, but they can kind of shape how they respond within them.
A very Taoist way of looking at it.
Yeah. I don't even know if that's an answer. Maybe it's just a cop out, but it's sort of like yeah. Again, I would just go with whatever kind of evidence I have will shape the nature of the claim I can make about it.
I think for me, when I was reading when he was talking about Tolstoy, it wasn't so much, well, perhaps with Tolstoy, the idea that, there was some supernatural or transcendent force pushing mankind in a certain direction, but that it was because it's so complicated, because it is millions of people, in your case, millions of people in two different nations, you have to sort of, the only way you can explain it in an intelligible way is to sort of talk about the net effect of all of these millions and millions of individual reactions. So if, to make it way too simple, if 10 million people were all working towards one goal and 10 million and two people were all working towards the other goal, the net would be a slight movement in that direction with the two people in excess. But there is this sense that, and this is the feeling I really get from sociology when I try to use sociological models in my work, is this idea that we acknowledge that individual peoples have agency, but if we're going to get anything useful out of it, we do have to kind of look at the net effect of everything. And I think that's something that I, as a historian, really have difficulty doing. I don't like to move too far away from the individual and the understandable nature of a single person. The mob mentality has always kind of frightened me, and I don't want to indulge in it too much in my historical work. And maybe that's just a personal preference.